Welcome to The Explainer. Today we are tackling something called Sophia's justice, and it's a concept that's going to force us to ask a pretty uncomfortable question. What if the very thing we call wisdom is actually the source of our problems? We usually think of wisdom as this ultimate good, right? The source of all things fair and orderly. But what if that's wrong? What if the very systems we've built on what we think is wisdom are actually causing the exact injustices we're trying so hard to fix? So our whole investigation really starts with this central puzzle. You've got these two phrases, Sophia's injustice and Sophia's justice. I mean, they look like total opposites, don't they? But as we're going to see, they're really just two sides of the same coin. So the big question is, how can wisdom be both the problem and the solution? Let's dive in and find out.
All right, to solve this puzzle, we first have to get a handle on the Sophia in Sophia's justice. Now, she's the ancient Greek personification of wisdom. But her story, well, it's way more complex and honestly more contradictory than you might think.
Okay, so just look at this journey wisdom has been on. It starts out as something really practical, like the skill of a craftsman. Then the philosophers get a hold of it and elevate it to this grand divine virtue. But here, and this is the crucial twist, Gnosticism hams along and imagines Sophia as a fallen creator, the one responsible for our flawed world. And that idea, the idea that divine wisdom could make such a massive, catastrophic mistake, that completely changes the game. It's what leads us to where we are today, seeing wisdom as this really contested concept.
So let's really zoom in on that Gnostic tradition, because honestly, it is the key to everything we're talking about. It introduces this really radical idea, this duality. On one hand, Sophia is an extension of the divine, of God. But on the other hand, she's the source of cosmic chaos. Through some kind of tragic error, she's the one who creates our imperfect material world. And that idea, that wisdom itself can be both divine and deeply flawed, well, that's the engine driving this entire puzzle. This brings us to a really important term for this whole explainer, polysemic. I know, it sounds like a fancy academic word, but all it really means is that Sophia represents a whole bunch of different, often competing, things all at once. So is she pure, transcendent wisdom, or is she the source of a massive, tragic mistake? The answer is, yeah, she's both. And that ambiguity, that tension, that is exactly the point. Okay, so we've got this complicated, kind of contradictory idea of wisdom on the table. Now let's look at the second piece of our puzzle, justice. Because you guessed it, just like Sophia, it is not nearly as straightforward as it seems. All right, and this is where you see the core conflict. On one side, you've got the modernist view. They see justice as this universal, objective principle, like a perfectly balanced scale. Injustice, that's just an error, something we can correct. But then the postmodern view comes along and just flips the script entirely. It argues that justice is really a product of power and language, a system that, by its very nature, benefits some groups over others. So from this perspective, injustice isn't some bug in the system, it's a feature. So postmodernism really goes after those big universal ideas, like progress or everyone is equal under the law, and it calls them meta-narratives. These are basically the grand, overarching stories a society tells itself to make its own power structures seem natural and legitimate. The big critique here is that these stories often do a really good job of hiding who's actually in control and, just as importantly, who's being left out. Okay, so if you're looking at it from this critical perspective, the whole search for one single, perfect, universal justice, it becomes what's known as an aporia, basically an unsolvable puzzle. I mean, think about it. If every definition of justice is really tied to a specific group's power, then how could there ever be one single version that truly works for everyone? It's a total impasse.
Okay, let's bring it all home. We have our pieces on the board. A really complex, contradictory Sophia on one side, and a contested, power-laden view of justice on the other. So now, let's put them together and finally, solve the puzzle of those two phrases we started with.
So, let's start with the jarring one. What does it really mean to shout Sophia's injustice? Well, it's not just some simple contradiction. It's actually a really sharp, sophisticated critique of how power and knowledge work in the real world. When someone says Sophia's injustice, they're making three really powerful claims all at once. First, they're calling out systems that say they're wise but are actually causing a lot of harm. Second, they're making the point that wisdom is never neutral. It's always tied to power. And third, it's a straight-up act of defiance. It's calling out the entire system as flawed, kind of like how the Gnostics saw Sophia's creation as this beautiful but broken thing. And this is what's so cool about it. It's what's known as a performative act. What that means is, by saying Sophia's injustice, you're not just describing a situation, you are actively doing something. You're taking the very idea of wisdom and turning it into a weapon to expose the system's failures. It's an incredibly powerful way to reframe the entire debate. Okay, so that's the injustice part. But what about Sophia's justice? If wisdom can be unjust, what in the world does it mean to call for a wise justice? It definitely can't mean going back to some perfect universal ideal, right? Because we've already figured out that's an aporia. It's basically impossible. This is where Sophia's justice becomes this really complex but also aspirational call to action. For one thing, there's a bit of irony to it. It's a nod to an ideal that we know we can't fully reach. But more importantly, it's a demand for a totally different kind of justice. Not one that's handed down from on high, but one that's negotiated on the ground in specific local situations. And finally, since Sophia is a feminine figure, it's often a call to bring back values like empathy and holistic understanding instead of just relying on rigid, abstract rules. So why does any of this matter? Well, this isn't just some abstract philosophical game. This shift in thinking has huge real-world implications. It fundamentally changes how we think about punishment, reward, and, well, the very nature of consequences. And you can see that evolution play out right here. We start at step 1, this belief that consequences are divine. They're handed down by an all-knowing Sophia. Then we get to step 2, a more cynical or critical view, where punishment and reward are just tools that society uses to keep control. And that takes us to step 3, a completely different way of seeing it. Here, consequences aren't about judgment at all. They're just the real-world effects, the ripples that our actions have on the health of our community. So in this new way of looking at things, Sophia's punishment isn't about sinning or breaking a divine rule. It's the breakdown of social order, the unraveling of the shared stories that hold us all together. And on the flip side, Sophia's reward isn't some heavenly prize you get for being good. It's the strengthening of the community itself. It's creating an environment where diverse perspectives can actually flourish. At the end of the day, it's all about one thing. Do our actions strengthen or weaken our shared world? So let's wrap this up. What are the big takeaways here? First, and this is a big one, wisdom is not always neutral or just. It's tangled up with power. Second, what we call justice is often just a story told by those in power. Third, questioning those so-called wise systems is a really powerful and important act. And finally, maybe true justice isn't some final verdict we arrive at, but a constant, messy, ongoing process of negotiation. And that's the thought we really want to leave you with. The next time you encounter a system, any system, that's presented as wise, or a decision that's called just, maybe pause for a second. Ask yourself these 2 simple questions. Whose wisdom? And whose justice?